Hi, I'm Dr. Greg Ellis, and I am a fan of the low carbohydrate diet. But why isn't the medical establishment? Why aren't physicians? Why aren't scientists? What happened to block their acceptance of this great, powerful program? This is a long, complex, twisted story. It took me many, many decades to unravel this because I was just reading the research papers, as was everyone else, trying to figure the whole thing out. It turns out there has been, over decades, many studies of diet composition where the scientists manipulate the percent of calories that are consumed as either protein, fat, and carbohydrate, and then they report the results. We all know that one of the greatest methods to fatten animals in the lab is to use something called the supermarket diet. That's a diet that's 60% in fat. 60% of the calories are in fat. And you will fatten an animal up real quick on that. What they never told you or tell you in the research paper is that diet is also high in carbohydrates. So it's the percent of the total calories that you consume that dictates what happens to the foods that you eat. So if you eat this high-fat diet that's also high in carbohydrates, you will store both the fat and the carbohydrates as fat. The carbohydrates get converted to body fat, and they store along and they drag the fat along with it. So you can get very fat eating this kind of diet, and they made animals terribly obese doing this. So these studies went on for decades and decades, and then other scientists would read the studies and they'd read the same thing. A high-fat diet would make you fat, and they bought into it. So that impeded any acceptance of the low-carbohydrate diet. Now, here's my argument. What they needed to do all along was be very specific about the percent of calories that made up the diet. For example, if the fat calories were 60% and the carbohydrate were 40%, you need to say this was a 40% carbohydrate diet and a 60% fat diet. Then you'd have an idea. Then you could determine it. Most scientists consider a diet that is 45 to 50% carbohydrate as a high carb diet, and a diet that's 40% as fat as a high-fat diet. Well, you can't compare them. You just can't even take a look at that and make any sense out of it because it doesn't work. It turns out that you have to significantly reduce the carbohydrates to a certain threshold level of the total percent of the calories you're consuming before you can get a metabolic effect. Very few people have looked at this. There's been very few studies looking at it, but there's been enough that I could cobble together a picture. And it looks like when you reduce your carbohydrates to about 25% of your total daily calories that you'll begin to get an effect from the low carbohydrate diet. Will reducing them further be more helpful? Absolutely. There's no question about it. Do you have to go to zero? I don't think so. I have been to zero, but I never saw much difference. So you get around 10%, 10 to 15% of your total calories in the day as carbohydrate. You will get a good effect from the low-carb diet. And then the fat won't get dragged into the fat cell along with that. As I say, it took me years to figure this thing out because you had to really read the methods and all the studies, and obviously all the other scientists who are looking at this stuff never figured it out, and they just still to this day don't have an idea. So when they see high-fat diet, all the results show that people and animals get fat. So a low-carb diet, which is theoretically high in fat, will make you fat based on the results of these diet composition studies. It's a real mess, and it really has hampered the movement toward the acceptance of the low-carb diet, both in terms of how many grams of carb one should consume in a day and how they should balance that consumption along with the calorie intake, because both of these things are operative. So what happens now with food intake? When you eat a high-fat, high-carb diet, the carbohydrate drives the conversion of the blood sugar, glucose, into body fat, and the hormone insulin potentiates this effect. But the fat gets dragged along with it. And now the blood begins to clear of fuel. And this blood is bathing all your active tissues, your brain, your lungs, your kidneys, your heart, your muscles, and there's very little fuel in it. And there's certainly hardly any fat in it. So the tissues aren't getting any fuel. So they collectively send a feeding signal to the brain and telling you, the animal, to eat. And you obey that biological drive because that's what you are. And you say, oh, okay, I'm hungry. And you will be hungry. You'll be starving. You're actually starving in the face of obesity. You're getting fat and you're starving. So you're going to obey those feeding signals and you're going to eat more. And you just stored a whole bunch of fat and carbohydrate as fat into your fat cell and got fatter yet. Now you're going to get fatter yet. Imagine doing this over a decade to 25 years, how fat you're going to be. Therefore, you've got to restrict the carbs, and the diet should be high in fat. A low-carb diet should be high in fat. It should not be high in protein because much of the protein we consume gets converted to carbohydrate, and I'll explain this in another video. And that becomes a problem because now you're getting bathed in carbohydrate again when you're not even eating any. Now, you want to do this on a regular basis and watch what you're doing and get to understand the carbohydrate grams that are in the different foods that you consume so you know how many grams that you're eating a day. If you're burning about 2,500 calories a day, let's say 2,000 for the sake of math, and you want to get to the threshold low carbohydrate level, which is 25%, each gram of carbohydrate has 4 calories in it. So 25% of 2,000 is what? 500. So that's about 125 grams of carbohydrate a day. I think that's still too high. You're going to have to get it lower than that. Many of the writers in the low-carb genre have argued for the consumption of between 60 to 80 grams of carbohydrate a day. And that's an okay number. Atkins, he starts you right off with 20 grams, and I assure you, you're not going to do it. Very few people will do it, and it's just not going to work that well for you. So the diet composition is very, very important, and this represents one of the major reasons why the establishment, the government, nutritionists, doctors, all of them, won't turn to the low-carb diet. There's a lot of other reasons, for example, the cholesterol issues and the saturated fat issues and many other issues that prevent them from acknowledging this. But at some point, someday, they're going to have to. There's no way around it. So that's how the diet composition thing plays into our body weight and our fat level. I'm Dr. Greg Ellis.